Welcome back to The Conservative. Hello there. This is the program for the last of 2019. So for those of you that are watching this last show for 2019, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. We'll see you in the new year, and hopefully we have a much more productive new year than we had in 2019 down in the swamp. And I think you'll find that more and more people are considering it the swamp. The professional political class, the elites down there have got to go. The more I watch what's happening, both on the Republican and Democratic side of the government, the more I think that these guys have got to get out of there. We've got to start considering term limits. We've got to start thinking about holding the feet to the fire for those who aren't doing a darn thing for you back here in Vermont, aren't doing a darn thing for the rest of the country. Spent 3 years now on a impeachment of a president who won a election in 2016 and should not be impeached because of that reason alone. And so Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has got the impeachment, as we come to this show, being held up, not being passed over to the Senate, which basically makes the impeachment null and void. But if you read the Constitution carefully, you know that she has to pass them over to the trial in the Senate, where it's dead on arrival, because no matter how you look at it, the Senate is got a majority of Republicans, and just like they had in the House, an unfair hearing where it was all bipartisan, all partisan, not bipartisan, it was all partisan, and the vote came down to where the Democrats voted, except for 3, for the impeachment, and 3 joined the Republicans, which made it a bipartisan vote against impeachment. But it was split right down the party lines, and that is the problem in the country today and why nothing's getting done. The animosity between the two groups is so strong, so miserably rotten, and so corrupt that there is not going to be a lot of good government being done. So they held up the Mexican, Canadian, USA trade agreement for almost a year, and as soon as the impeachment was done, in order to prove that they could impeach and also do government, they passed the legislation. How very inappropriate. Here we have a section of trade agreements that is going to, by the lowest estimate possible, create another 200,000 jobs here in America, which is incredible for the economy, the only economy in the world that's booming right now, giving us an opportunity to increase our economic well-being for all Americans, held up by the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi because of their desire to impeach a president. And I hope all of you are watching carefully exactly what is going on here, because the left has said that they were going to impeach this president, the imposter, the one who didn't win the election, and have said it since the day he was elected. And even some people were saying, and I can remember this being said on NBC when they had a panel up there, that when Trump came down the escalator and announced that he was going to run for president, 2 of the commentators said that was the biggest joke on earth, and one other said that if he should ever get elected, they would impeach him. So that's so ludicrous, because 63 million Americans voted for Trump to be in, and the East and West Coast big cities voted for Hillary to be president. Well, thank God for the Electoral College, because that allows the big cities to not have as much power to wield over all the rest of us. That's a problem here in Vermont. We have Chittenden County, we have the largest population in Burlington area, and they vote in all of the left-wing, socialistic, communistic perceptions for the state that have basically ruined the conservative values here. And we have a state that is in economic trouble. We have a state that has a freebie giveaway system that is so big that we can't sustain it and can't afford it. And so people wonder why in the world people under the age of 45 are leaving the state. Well, they can't afford the taxes, can't find a good job, can't find good entertainment, then go somewhere else. And that's where they are headed. And as long as, and you watch carefully down in Texas, people are moving into Texas out of California. They're bringing their politics with them, and they're going to change that state from a very conservative Bible Belt, religious believing communities, slowly but surely turning it from a red state to a blue state because they're bringing their politics with them. It's like Bernie Sanders coming to Vermont with his socialistic view, never having a job and always working on the public dole, and has convinced everybody that he's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And people don't look at the crusty old man and realize that he's not the greatest since sliced bread, and don't realize that he is advocating for the overthrow of America and for the establishment of a socialistic system, which means that the professional political class maintain their power and maintain their wealth at your expense. Meanwhile, your ability to rely on a constitution that forces us as free men to govern ourselves versus that of a tyrant, which I've never seen in history. If you go back and take a look at all the socialistic countries in the world from way back to currently, there's never been a socialistic nation that has not had a tyrant or has moved down that road. And I said in my last show, if you recall, those of you that are intellectually elite, because you've got, quote, a great education in school books, but not necessarily with any good street smart common sense. Common sense isn't very common. Those kind of folks wind up dead in a socialistic society, because when they start waking up from the hot pan of frog water, as I've said in 3 previous shows, those folks begin to argue about the fact that they've lost their freedoms. And because you've lost your freedoms, the tyrant takes you out. And all you have to do is go look at the past practices in the Soviet Union and how that went from the czars to Marxist-Leninist communism to Stalin, who became the dictator. And all you have to do is take a look at Hitler and realize that he took out many of the intellectual Catholics, many of the intellectual Christians, many of the intellectual Jews. Of course, he took out all the Jews he could find, because that was his final result, what he believed was the final way to take the Jews off the face of the earth. And that became part of his legacy and his desire from the day he began his assault on the German society to become the dictator there. And of course, thank God for America that stood in that breach, and Great Britain who stood in that breach. But Great Britain was in deep trouble when we came into the war. And I find it very interesting, if you read Hitler and who he was reading and who he was trying to emulate, believe it or not, there's enough reports out there that he was actually reading a lot about and what FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, was doing in this country, trying to create the new free deal. Well, the new free deal, if you look very, very carefully at history, actually slowed the progress of us coming out of that recession, much like Obama's attempt to bring us out of the last recession, which took forever. Now look at what's going on, and you'll hear the left say, well, the reason that Trump is so successful is the fact that Obama put it in place. No, he didn't. This country in 2016 was still deep in the mire of a recession. And Trump on his campaign basically said he was going to make America great again by placing tariffs on nations that were ripping us off, looking at trade, looking at the way we needed to bring manufacturing back. If you recall, Obama and the left said that we would never see manufacturing back in the United States again. A way to ruin the country would be to take out the productive disposition of the nation and refuse to allow folks to become part of the old society. Well, we have to blend the transition. We can go to the future of America and realize that we are going to be a giving of information nation, but that's not going to become part of this nation for at least 3 generations. Number one, it takes time to change the educational system if the left allows us to do it. The left controls the educational system, it controls the media. All they have to do right now is continue to control the production, and if they ever get control of religion, which they're vastly trying to do, and control healthcare, they've now got everything under their control, and you've lost it all, because when you finally do not have the right to choose your health care benefit, you don't have the right to choose life or death, and the government's choosing it for you. Sarah Palin was not that incorrect when she used to talk about the death panels. By the way, those are in the original Obamacare, 3,500 pages. And of course, they went after her for calling them death panels, but what it really was to look at whether or not the best practices would allow someone to get a heart transplant or a kidney transplant or an operation if they were not any longer contributing members of society. Contributive justice is what it was called. In other words, you'd reached the age of 65 and you were basically retired, and you were no longer a productive member of society, that perhaps you would not get the services, the healthcare services necessary that a 45-year-old might get, because that 45-year-old had another 20 years to be a productive tax-paying citizen, whereas 65, then you get to be 75, you get to be 85, you now become a part of the burden on the economic system, better known as Social Security. When FDR put together the Social Security system based on the French precepts of that retirement plan, no one expected people to live past 65. To get to 72 would be amazing. To get now to 85 and 90, it is breaking the system. Oh, no, it's not. It's not breaking the system. What's breaking the system is the number of people that have been placed on disability in that program, which was never designed for, and the number of people who have been legislators who have raided that fund and have taken that money to spend elsewhere and don't tell you about it. There's lots and lots of money being spent out there in this country that comes out of other funds. Mr. Trump just did it recently when he took money out of the defense fund to continue to build the wall. The wall needs to be funded. We're the only country this large in the world that doesn't have some form of fencing, some form of wall, some form of security, making sure that illegals don't come into this nation. And most people will agree that legals belong here. When we talk about everybody is an immigrant in America, they're absolutely right. But other than the original immigrants who were sent here by way of boats, many out of prisons from England and elsewhere, or through the slave trades, both whites and blacks and Asians, those folks came here legally or by enslavement. But now we are looking at people that are just coming into the country illegally. We have laws in place that force us to think about what's the difference between legal and illegal. Legal immigration is great for this nation. Illegal immigration is a tax economic burden on the nation, and nobody wants to talk about it. I find it ludicrous and hypocritical when Bill Clinton was the man that wrote the law that prevented folks from coming across this country without being stopped at the border. And Mr. Obama wrote the law that developed the prisons, the encampments, and took children away from their parents. And yet, who gets blamed for it all? Mr. Trump. President Trump, go back and take a good look at who created the law. And so President Trump believes in enforcing it through his administrative judiciary process. And people, the press, owned by the Democrats, desires to destroy it. And all you have to do is go back and read. I just wish that just for once, people that watch this show and people that I talk to would take a few minutes per day, maybe 15 minutes or 20 minutes is what most people require children to read right now, 20 minutes a night, and spend 20 minutes, instead of watching the TV and watching reruns and over and over again the same news cycle or whatever that it is that you're watching, or the same reruns of whatever is running on television, I just wish people would take and pick up a book and start reading about American history, and start from World War II forward. That would be good. Or start from the 1950s and go forward and find out what's really going on, so that you would at least have enough knowledge to create your own understanding, so that when you're talking to somebody, you might be able to talk with some wisdom versus just out the side of your mouth without any clue as to what you're talking about. And I watch and see that all the time, people who can't listen to the other side because they haven't got anything other than a yell and a position of yelling to try to shut a person down. It's what the left does. You can see it all the time. They yell and they scream and they put people out of place. And so even in the impeachment trials of the last 3 years, and in particular the last 2 months, if you take a real good look at what happened there, you're looking carefully at Nancy Pelosi now holding up the impeachment papers, the articles, to go over to the Senate, which is totally against the Constitution of the United States. The House of Representatives has the right to impeach. They've done it. The Senate has the right to the trial. And that information needs to be brought over. And we'll see what happens there. But they don't get the control on, as they're trying to control, the people who are going to be called as witnesses. As far as I'm concerned, the witness list that was over in the House is the only witness list that should come over to the Senate. Because they have enough witnesses there to look at and say, well, what part of this do you know? Well, I never heard it, never saw it. So hearsay evidence, I would think, would be thrown out. Now, the problem also is that the House never had any kind of a criminal charge, which the Constitution demands for an impeachment, high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, hate to tell you this, but if you read very carefully, abuse of power is not a crime. Abuse of power has been by every single president that I've ever read about, including George Washington, who used his and abused his power to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Well, isn't that interesting? Because Obama loaded a ton of money on pallets, put them in a plane, and sent them over to Iran. And I suspect that was an abuse of power because he expected a quid pro quo from that. So isn't it interesting? The left never said a word about that being wrong. Most people on the right did. Most common sense Americans were appalled to think that an enemy of this nation, such as Iran, who's trying to get a nuclear bomb so that they can blow Israel off the face of the earth, the day that happens, everybody, you realize that we're going to be in deep, deep war. We'll have to unleash our nuclear arsenal, which could unleash China's and Russia's nuclear arsenal. So very, very interesting to see all that hypocritical dynamics going on. But abuse of power is not a crime. Now the obstruction of Congress. Whoops, another thing that is not a crime. The obstruction of Congress is to go forward to the third branch of the government, the judiciary. And that is where the executive branch has all of its legal claims placed right now over into the judiciary side of the argument. That's what the Constitution demands, is that when the executive branch believes that they're right, Congress believes they're right, you go to the courts. The courts determine, according to the Constitution, who is right and who is wrong. But oh no, let's not do that because, oh gee, we have some constitutional lawyers and some constitutional judges now in places where that might actually be considered, and it might go to the way of the right. Well, that means corruption. That means that the left is accusing the constitutional scholars, the constitutional judges, of being corrupt. Well, gee whiz, I suspect that if you look carefully at the judges on the Supreme Court that are placed there by the left, you could say the exact same thing. I would not consider Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a constitutional judge. She has done a lot on the bench that was judgment from the bench and the creation of the law by judges. So has Kagan, so has Sotomayor. Those folks, those are the three women that I can think of right off the hand, who believe that the Constitution is a living document and can be changed according to their whim and will as they sit as judges. That's not what the Founding Fathers designed. That's not what the Founding Fathers envisioned. And you can read the Federalist Papers, you can read the underlining comments by the Founding Fathers on what they meant by the executive branch, the legislative branch, and also the judiciary branch. There's three separate places for government. Why they did that is because they did not want to have a tyranny. They did not want to have a dictatorship. They did not want to have a king like King George. And so they threw out the common law, the bad parts of the common law of England. They kept some of the great parts of the common law of England, but they threw out the parts that caused severe angst amongst the colonists. And they changed it so that it would be a government run by men and women. So I'm not so sure that we shouldn't think very carefully about term limits so that we eliminate this professional political class. I'm not so sure that we don't take a look at the 17th Amendment of the Constitution and realize that, maybe the Senate and the power of the Senate comes back to the states versus the way it is right now, which goes back to the haunt of Hillary won the election because she had the popular vote. No, she had the popular vote in the major cities. Well, that happens in New York right now. There's a lot of New York State who would like to see a conservative state. However, if you look out in Buffalo, and you look out at Liverpool, and you look out at Rochester, you look out at New York City, the big cities in the state, they control the rest of the population because the folks in New York City are very, very liberal-minded, and they get a ton of the money that's there. So that causes a great amount of angst amongst folks who want to see it different. The Founding Fathers recognized that, and that's why in order to get the states to even join the Union, they developed the Electoral College, which meant that a little state like Vermont would have an equal voice, an equal vote in the Electoral College based on its population versus the big cities. So yes, I think the Democrats are very likely to win the big cities again in the next election. They are not going to win the election based on the big cities. They're going to win the election if they can muster enough votes out there in middle America. The small Americans, small population Americans who tend to have a self-reliance still, tend to have a constitutional view of the way this government should be. So they still believe that American men and women are smart enough to run their own government. They do not need to worship the government. They don't still believe in the government, and that's why Obama said that we had to destroy these folks that believed in the Second Amendment. We had to destroy those people that believed in the First Commandment. He went right after those subjects when he said those Bible-believing deplorables. That was his administration. He didn't use all those words, but he was at the top of the helm. And I'm sorry, but when you're at the top of the heap, as Truman said, the buck stops here. So when things are happening in your administration, you're responsible for them, whether you know about them or not. That's a part of what happened to Mr. Nixon. President Nixon did not know all that was going on, although it looks as if when he did resign, he would have been impeached, but also that he did know a lot about some of the things that were going on, and that's why he erased some of the tapes that were in his office. Cover-up. So this quid pro quo in Ukraine, the press is trying to tell you that Mr. Biden and his son didn't have anything to do with Ukraine oil. Well, they did, and they made a fortune. But nobody's talking about the fact that Pelosi and Schiff both have interest in Ukraine. Isn't that very interesting? These two, if you look deeply into the processes that are going on in Ukraine, they have economic interest there. Go read good, reliable, fact-finding reporters, and you will find that both the left and the right, there are reporters, by the way, that are good reporters both on the left and the right. They report as reporters and journalists are supposed to, facts. They don't throw in their opinion. They dig up and research the facts and then they present the facts to you. And those are the reporters you want to go and read. And there are some very good ones out there. I could name them, but I'm not going to do that. It's your job to go off and find them on your own and find the ones that you care to read. And whatever you do, make sure you read those who are on the left and those who are on the right. You cannot form in this political environment of 2019 going into 2020 now, and probably for the next 10 years, the destructive press, and form an opinion based on one side. If you read only the left, you will not get an accurate view. If you read only the right, you will not get an accurate view. Now, that being said, when you look at TV shows, and you look at Rachel Maddow, or you look at Sean Hannity, Sean Hannity has the highest rating cable news show in the cable news world. Rachel Maddow's down number 3 or 4, whatever she is, but people watch, you watch all of these folks. You got to realize that I don't know if Rachel Maddow says so much, but Hannity says it all the time, and that is, he is a opinion show. It's his opinion. So you have the right to listen to his show and form your opinion. It's not always absolutely one fully cited news. And he tells you that. He'll say, I'm looking at it from this side. And of course, the press goes after him for that and says, well, he's in the back pocket of President Trump. Well, he is a person that believes things that are going on the right-hand side. He's very conservative. He tells you that. Rachel Maddow on the other side of the coin doesn't say those kinds of things, but the research journalist press will tell you that she is a conspiracy theorist. She trumps up conspiracies and she keeps hawking them, and hawked for years the Russian collusion story, which was proven to not be true by the Mueller report, and the left hated that. For 2.5 years, we heard nothing about the fact that when Mueller got done, this would destroy the presidency. What we're finding out right now is that the presidency has been under attack by the left from the day he stepped into office, especially from the judiciary branch, the FBI. That is disgusting. And those of you who think that the FBI is perfect, just go look at Clint Eastwood's newest movie called Richard Jewell, and you'll understand that Atlanta bombing situation at the Olympics, when they took this hero and made him the scapegoat for what they couldn't find, and they destroyed him. Of course, you know Richard Jewell finally committed suicide. You can also take a look at how they botched the anthrax investigation in September 11, 2001. You could take a look at that and realize that, oh my God, that's unbelievable. Is that they trump up evidence to finish their case, and they don't necessarily look at everything, or they're not absolutely fair. And so the FBI is now under huge investigation. It will be interesting to see slowest turtles walking down the walkway at how fast the government finds out exactly who's been corrupt there, and if there are ever any charges. And obviously, there were all kinds of charges that should have been brought against Hillary Clinton. Never were, never going to be. That's the problem with the judiciary system right now in this country. There is the political elite, the professional political elite, that get away with a ton of things, and no retribution, no consequences for behavior. Same violation of the law by you or I would cause instant indictment, grand jury, and off to court we'd be. And so it's going to be very interesting to see at the end of 2020 if there are any charges coming to those who violated the law. I'll bet you, as I sit here right now, I'll be shocked if by the end of 2020 there is any indictments. I hope I'm wrong, and that would be true. Well, in the last show, I did make a mistake, and I was looking over the show, which I do on occasion, and I realized that I said that one of the folks that had been impeached was Andrew Jackson. Totally wrong. It had been Andrew Johnson. that have been impeached. We've only had 3 presidents impeached by the House. None of them ever been convicted. None of them ever been thrown out of their office. The will of the people was maintained. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump. And this was a attempt, people will call it a coup, to destroy Trump. Well, we've come to a new year and a new show. Next time you see me, it'll be 2020. Thanks a lot for watching. See you next time. Bye now.